Bueno, muchas gracias a Agustín Tejeda, ya nunca se me va a volver a olvidar, nunca, por su intervención, por todo este panorama tan enriquecedor de Argentina. Y vamos a agradecer ahora a Mulan Kemi, el líder mundial en aditivación y estandarización de las harinas. Nuestra misión, con nuestras soluciones personalizadas, empoderamos a los molineros de todo el mundo a producir harina con un rendimiento perfecto. Nuestra visión, alimentar al mundo con harina excelente. Y llegó el momento de dar paso a la última charla de ALIM 2025, titulada Trigo de Australia, y estará a cargo de Nektarios Tsirbas, Consejero Agrícola de la Embajada de Australia para América del Sur. Así que, Nektarios, el escenario es tuyo, el tiempo en pantalla está al frente para que lo tengas pendiente. Bienvenido.
Perfecto. Buenas tardes a todos. En primer lugar, me gustaría agradecer a la Asociación Nacional de Empresarios de Colombia, ANDI, y la Federación de Molineros de Trigo de Colombia, FEDEMOL, también a ALIM por invitarme a presentar en nombre de Australia en la Asamblea. En particular, me gustaría agradecer a la directora Pilar Ortiz Olaya, directora ejecutiva de la Cámara, por hacer posible este espacio. Sé que ahora soy lo único que se interpone entre ustedes y la clausura de la Asamblea, así que espero no abusar de su hospitalidad. En primer lugar, me presento, soy el consejero de Agrícola Australia y Sudamérica, representante del Departamento de Agricultura, Pesca y Silvicultura del Gobierno de Australia. Para ahorrarlas a todos ustedes a mi español, pasaré ahora a inglés para mi presentación y actualización. Gracias. So this is, I think, the first time Australia has presented at ALIM. So it's very exciting and groundbreaking in many ways. It's been a joint effort with Grains Australia and Grain Trades Australia, which I'll talk about a little later. They're two organisations that represent the Australian grains industry and the Australian grain traders. What the last decade has actually shown us is, for all of us importers and exporters alike, it's always good to have options and markets, and as many markets as possible. Diversification is not just from international markets instability, but it's also from climate variability. I know we're having a lot of instability right now with international markets, but it wasn't so long ago that Australia was having significant issues on a number of commodities with some of our trading partners in Asia. And one of the things that we found was there were a range of other markets we could go to because of the work over many decades we'd done with those countries. Some of those markets, as it turns out, were in South America. So we'll get to some of those slides, but you'll see that Australia's already got a presence in a number of grains and a number of commodities in South America. They started probably 4 or 5 years ago. I think at the time people were interested in Australian grain because it was essentially trading at a low price, but many have stuck with it because of the benefits in terms of quality. So, and so this opportunity to actually talk about wheat, something that we haven't traded into South America for at least 20 or 30 years. Indeed, the last time we traded wheat was actually to Colombia back in 2023. So because this is a summary of the presentation, so I'll run through a bit of the history. Apologies, it may be a little long, but I feel that we haven't been here for so long, we need to go through, give a bit of a description about Australia and our production systems. And then before moving on to our forecast for this year. One takeaway from the last 3 years that I have been in South America. This is a bit of an indulgence. We've got a picture there of Australian farmers with a John Deere. Nearly every agricultural show that I've gone to in South America, the busiest place at an agricultural show is the John Deere shop. So I didn't bring my cap here today, but I know that nearly everybody who visits an exposition here in South America will either take away a cap, a shirt, or a little model tractor to take home for their children. So a bit of a description describing about Australia. So 3,900 kilometres from east to west, 23 million hectares planted to commercial grains. Most of our grains are winter crops. There's only a very small amount in summer crops. Winter crops ranges between 30 and 70 million tonnes. We won't reach 70 million tonnes this year, but we could come in around 60. The summer crop is much, much smaller, 2 to 5 million tonnes. Obviously, with such a great area of growing areas, we've got soils, climatic conditions, farming systems, and a range of both domestic and international markets that we can service from both the East Coast and the West Coast. Domestic grains the domestic market is actually our largest buyer of wheat. So they account for anywhere from 25 to 35% of the Australian wheat crop in Australia, and something similar in terms of barley. Now on that map, you'll see that we have a number of ports and a number of traders identified. In 2008, there were 18 ports operated by 4 companies. Today, there are 30 ports or grain handling facilities operated by 18 companies. That means more competition, that means more options for trading. And what we've found, particularly in the region for some of the trades that happened at the start 4 or 5 years ago, was that it was in fact the smaller traders who looked at the market, started the discussions in the region, and because we have so many traders, that gives you potentially more options and may indeed make our products obviously competitive. We've got some of the big players there, Bunge, Viterra, CBH, which you might be familiar with, the old West Australian Grains Board, but now a private company, GrainCorp and Cargill, but we've also got some smaller players like Rawdon's, Grain Services, Emerald and Quattro. So this is a bit of a picture of our grain producing areas. It's obviously the big green bit in the middle is largely desert. The bit up to the north is tropical, so grains are very, very rarely grown in those northern regions above the Tropic of Capricorn, which is from that green dot up there northwards. For Australia, we have low rainfall areas with rainfall as low as 280 to 350 millilitres annually to high rainfall zones of 600 to 800 mils. That's a far cry from some of the high rainfall zones that we see in South America. When I was in Brazil last year, around Curitiba and Passo Fundo and Guarapuava, I think our rainfall pales into insignificance. So our average yields are from 2 to 7 tonnes for wheat, but the vast majority is 2 to 3 tonnes. The only area that gets anywhere near 6 or 7 is Tasmania, and that's our smallest producing state. Another important fact, 95% of the grain grown in Australia is rain-fed, so it's very uncommon to have irrigated wheat. The cropping regions, have got the northern cropping region from central and southern Queensland through to northern New South Wales, which is over to the east of that map. Winter crops planted from March in Queensland through to July in New South Wales, with harvests from September to December. Southern cropping regions stretch down, obviously in the south, but not to the western part of our country map there. Plantings there from May up to July, with harvest from October to January. Western cropping, the southern western corner of Western Australia, planting in April, May for harvest from late October to January. This year, a lot of the harvest has actually been delayed. Victoria, South Australia started, and southern New South Wales have started about 2 to 3 weeks late. West Australian similar. When we get to the figures about where we are in the harvest, you'll see that if we had to reach around 60 million tonnes of grain at the moment we're only a quarter of the way through, so we've only picked up around 15 million tonnes of grain delivered to traders. So the spread of grain production I've already mentioned, and the different grains. This gives you a bit of a split up of what our grain crop looks like. Wheat's overwhelmingly the largest crop. The 5-year average, this is the 5-year average production. If we went 5 years ago, or if you go to 6 years, the average production is nothing like 33.8 million tonnes. It would have been closer to 28 million tonnes if we were using the averages last year because of the drought in the previous years. But you can see that obviously barley is our second largest crop. Here's a bit of a rainfall map. This is over the last 30 years. So it's limited use in one way because there's a huge amount of diversity. We have large periods of drought where you won't get anything like that. But what it does show is the tropical areas in the north, the desert in the middle, and that generally, our rainfall, a lot of the areas that we are growing grain are low rainfall areas. For the most recent year for which we have data, this is a bit more of a breakup. This is still an estimate. It'll be finalised by the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resource Economics probably over the next few months. For the next outlook, we'll probably have more concrete figures, but here's the indication. In the end, 24-25, we saw 34.1 million tonnes of wheat. That's the breakup you can see there from each of the states. Western Australia accounts for the majority of our wheat production, but with significant quantity, New South Wales and Western Australia. Western Australia does account for the majority of our barley exports, but not necessarily our wheat production, but we are expecting a very big harvest of wheat in Western Australia this year. I won't go through the rest of the state figures, but that's for the moment. Before moving on to wheat, I just might dwell on this slide for a moment. I'll only point out probably one feature, and that's the silos or the storage, the on-farm storage. About 65% of Australian farmers have on-farm storage. It's very common for them to hold back grain from the market if they don't like the price. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 days about the price and what China will do and what farmers might do. This is in Australia's example, there'll be a number of farmers, and there are already signs of farmers wanting to hold on to their wheat, hoping that the price might recover. Of course, there's never any guarantee of that, but because of the vast amount of storage, it does mean that farmers actually have a fair bit of flexibility about when they sell, and the buyers need to work a little harder to prize that out of farmers at any time of the year. So this is an average of the Australian grain production. I saw Canada and Argentina and the US also provide some averages. I mentioned this is over the last 25 years. 2022-23 was our peak. That was our largest grain growing period. 4 of the last 5 years have been our largest record crops for grain, our largest record crops for wheat. So 2024 came in at around the 4th largest wheat crop. So we're still waiting on, I know everyone will be waiting to see what 2025 is going to look like. But one thing I have put there on the map is as a line, which is the trend line, to show that even though we have huge amounts of variation, the trend has been over a number of years for increased production, which I think tracks against what we've seen with Canada, the US, and now Argentina. This is a similar map, obviously, for the last 25 years of exports. You'll see a huge variation there. Obviously, the numbers were very down during the drought years of 2018-19 and 2017-18. A lot of the wheat ended up going into domestic fodder to supply animals and feed in Australia, and to supply that 30% of the market that uses wheat in Australia. But just in terms of 2024, in terms of our exports, that was 21 million tonnes at around $5.6 billion US. In terms of the markets, so you have a picture here of 23-25. it's a little misleading in one way, because obviously the majority of our exports are going to Asia at the moment, in the Asian region. 70% of our exports approximately is exported, and that's fairly consistent between 65 and 70, except in those particularly large drought years. One thing we've seen is obviously China stepped back. We're expecting that in 24-25 they only purchased, they purchased 1.5 to 2 million tonnes of Australian wheat. That's a far cry from 22-23, where they were heavy into the market and they purchased something like 7.5 or 7.6 million tonnes of Australian wheat. That was quite unusual, because the preceding year China would have ranked 5th, 6th or 7th on our export markets. It was also a strange year because at the same time, obviously, we were having significant difficulties with a number of other commodities. But if you look at that, if you'd looked at that map 20 years ago, China would have been somewhere like 20th or 30th in rank, and the majority of our exports would have been to the Middle East. I put this one up. I mentioned that about exports of Australian grains and commodities to Latin America. Some of this is a bit of a history, some of it is what's happening now. On the right, you can see these are our exports. This is the last time I think we exported wheat to Colombia, but also barley. So we have a history of exporting barley and wheat to Colombia. Obviously, there are, unlike a number of the US and Canada and a few other countries that have trade agreements, it very much depends on what the tariff is at the time, though I note at the moment there's a suspension in place and has been for the last 3 or 4 years in Colombia. We've also got there what we're exporting currently on barley. So we started back in 2021. I think that was our first. Yeah, that was our first year. I think, as I mentioned at the time, there was probably an expectation from many that, because historically Australian barley was seen as expensive. I think 2 things have happened. I know this is a miller's meeting rather than a beer maker's meeting, but it's interesting in the sense of some of the premiums we used to see in the Chinese market aren't there anymore. And the other element is that we find that in South America, people and millers, whether it's and particularly beer makers, will pay a premium if it suits their operations, and that appears to be what's been happening. We're actually a bit optimistic that we might see potential progress coming down the track in Colombia, if not potentially even Brazil. So a little bit about the industry. I'm just going to quickly run through these. They're a bit text heavy, and I know everyone's probably getting hungry or hoping to close the meeting soon. So we've got 3 organisations: the Grains Research and Development Corporation, Grains Australia and Grains Trade Australia. They're the 3 organisations that really represent the grains industry. The Grains Research and Development Corporation, not dissimilar to Wheat Associates in the sense that a levy is collected on behalf of the grains industry. The government matches some of that. Its role is, however, purely research and development. It doesn't have a trade promotion role. Even though the Australian government does match their funding, at the moment, the harvests have been so large, we're actually unable to fully match their funding because of the amount of money they're actually receiving. I think the Grains Research Development Corporation, as we saw, from the last count, had $1 billion on its books for research projects. So, at least in the last year, they've invested around $156 million US into research and development. A lot of that work is also related to extension, which is training farmers on new technologies and adopting new processes. So I've also put in that a graph that I know everyone also has put in around productivity improvements. So even though we've gotten drier, even though we've had droughts, all through that time, the innovation and technology through organisations like the Grains Research Development Corporation has increased funding. So the other organisation is Grains Australia. It was established by the Grains Research and Development Council as an industry good organisation. It doesn't undertake research and development activities, but it does have responsibilities for managing classification, market access, and market information and education. There used to be another organisation that it's merged with, which is called the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre. That organisation does a number of activities. It's been quite active in South America, particularly in the barley space. It's done a number of webinars and seminars, and it's planning to potentially do those in the future as well, around not just wheat, but other Australian grains, just to give people in South America a few options, but also a bit better of an education around what Australia produces and how it might fit their businesses. And the last organisation I have there is Grain Trades Australia. That's probably a very busy slide, but it's the body who represents the Australian traders. Effectively, all Australian traders are members of that organisation. At the end of the presentation, I'll put up their website, but on their website you can find the contact for every Australian grain trading organisation, and usually the name listed on there is the person who'll respond. Especially with the smaller and the medium companies, they're usually the owners or the operators of those businesses. So some of the things that they're responsible for, Grain Trades Australia's trade standards, setting contracts and rules, dispute resolution, trade policy and market access, and industry stewardship and capability. Across all of these three organisations, it is important to note that Australian industry does a lot of what in many countries would be done by government. We have very much a industry stewardship model. So just bear with me, I lost some of my notes before, so I'm going to have to, as we move to the next one. But ultimately, this slide's about some of the strengths of Australian grains. Clean, safe environment. I think Australia is often recognised. We like to say we're clean and green, but I'm pretty sure that most of the other wheat producers that are here today will say exactly the same, and I would have to agree that I think the amount of work that's gone into sustainability and other types of research is, you've really seen some huge advancements in the way farmers farm, and whether it's their fertiliser use, their pesticides use, and low-till farming. High quality product, internationally recognised. There's a reason why we're one of the world's leading wheat exporters in the world, and why, particularly in Asia, we work very, very closely with our partners historically for the types of grains they need, but there's opportunity to work with other trading partners around the world as well. The reliability of the supply chain. Whilst we've had issues in the past with trading partners, as you saw from the number of trading ports in Australia located everywhere, several of those purely dedicated for the handling of grain. So we've got a very complex logistical system, and we have ports from the East Coast through to the West Coast. The codes of practice, we mentioned Grain Trades Australia produces a number of publications and codes for not just how traders operate, but also how handling is done at the port, how wheat is transported, how it's loaded. So it's a little unusual in the number of codes of practice and the industry self-regulation that takes place as well. So we've got there the trade contracts and commercial activities. So Grain Trades Australia takes the huge responsibility in setting a standard contract for people buying Australian wheat and for what's expected from those selling Australian wheat. So that's one of the tasks that has responsibility for. And of course the trust of the contracting counterparties, which is obviously with everyone a member of Grain Trades Australia. The codes of conduct and the other rules around trade, that gives confidence in who you're dealing with. I've mentioned some of these code of practices, and obviously the most important elements, of course, is results at the end. I might just skip through some of that because I know the next part is probably the most interesting. Here is we've got Australian wheat varieties are classified into 10 classes to meet distinct quality attributes. for processing uses. Grains Australia administers and manages that grain classification system, which I mentioned before. These classifiers serve as a guide, so ultimately whether it's bread, biscuits or pasta and noodles. So I think that's not particularly different to others. This slide I actually have up is actually some of the more around Australian wheat and the qualities. So I might just skip back. What it's well known for, all Australian grains are well known for, is a low moisture content, high flour yield with low ash, with high extraction rates. A soundness and test weight and strength of the proteins mean high quality, white bran. I've put in a reference here to colour and for noodles. I know that might seem strange, but when I was in Brazil last year and I met with one of the members of Trigo, one of the questions they asked me was, we know you have low protein wheats. We have a population in Brazil that really wants noodles. And it's hard for us to find that low protein wheat. So that was why that's there, but that was very interesting. And of course, excellent performance in products. This is, I guess, this is a more detailed breakup of our classifications. Australian hard, which is Duro Australiano, and Blanco Premium Australiano, or Australian Premium White. They're probably the two most similar to some of the wheats that are traded into Colombia and into South America. They generally, we internationally would match them up against Canadian Western Red Spring and the US hard red wheat. That's effectively the equivalence, or what we would, in terms of competition, consider the equivalence. And when we're looking at price, that's usually what we benchmark against. That also gives you an indication of the protein level, the general protein levels, but also how much of that wheat is actually produced. You'll see that, at the top we've only got a very small percentage of of APH wheat, Australian Prime Hard, but and then much higher percentages of Australian Hard, Australian Premium wheat, and Australian soft wheat. Now this is a little bit about effectively around sustainability and the supply chain. This is actually, that diagram, it'll be hard to see, but what it is essentially looking at is essentially 6 characteristics, and as you go out from the circle, it basically identifies what's in place to protect those qualities. So in the case of food safety, it has a combination of, we have regulatory authorities, which is Food Standards Australia and New Zealand for the consumer. We have export authorities, which is my department, which deals with the certification and the export of product. Then we have industry standards that also guide the collection and the standard of delivery of the product. And then you go against, then you have traceability, sustainability, and I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, but they give a bit more information of what actually underpins some of those characteristics in Australia. This is a survey that was done, and this is, I think, similar to the Canadian presentation. This is a survey that was done around what was important to consumers. It was done by CBH, which is one of the largest, obviously, producers and exporters of wheat and traders. It was interesting, and probably no surprise to millers, that whilst obviously there's an increased call on issues around sustainability and climate credentials, ultimately chemical residues and traceability are the things that people are most concerned with, and millers are most concerned with. So, and of course the nutrition. So those 3 things, and I think you would have done this 20 years ago and it would say the same thing. I think it'll say the same thing in 20 years' time. Whilst there's a lot of demands on climate change and carbon neutrality and other elements, that ultimately for millers and for buyers of wheat, as you can see from the fact that more and more people are consuming bread and bread products, that nutrition, health, traceability, and low chemical residues are the most important components. So we finally get to the forecast, which I know people will be probably the most interested in. So, effectively a summary here. We've had favourable winter conditions through with a positive spring outlook two months ago, we were looking at downgrading production, but the late rains basically came at exactly the right time. Whilst it's a delay harvest, we're looking at much better numbers than we were. For wheat, 25-26 is forecast to be below 24-25 season levels. Now, this is ABARES forecast at the moment, and when you see the figures, it doesn't necessarily align with some of the private industry figures, and it doesn't align with what the US gains report are saying either. But either way, what we're looking at is the fourth largest year on record, well above the 10-year average, but just under the 5-year average, but the 5-year average has been exceptionally high, and really it's an exceptional period for Australia. Overall crop prices we're expecting to come down this year, so we obviously benefit for Australia, we trade in Australian dollars, so at the moment Australian dollar only buys 66 US cents, so roughly around $251 a tonne. And overall, even though we are saying that the actual exports are going to be, the production is going to be down, actual exports we expect to be up, even though the value is down, simply because there is we're looking at something like 24.5 million tonnes exported. There were carryover stocks from last year. So in terms of the progress of the harvest, Queensland and New South Wales are well advanced. In fact, Queensland's effectively harvested all of its wheat. New South Wales probably around 55%. I'll show a diagram a bit later from Bendigo Bank, which gives updated figures as of this week. It's still early days in Western Australia and South Australia and Victoria. South Australia and Victoria have had delays in the last 2 weeks. They've had untimely rains, which stop-started the harvest. So as I mentioned, even though we're expecting a 60 million tonne overall grain harvest, it's only progressed to around 15 million tonnes at the moment. So that could be a concern when we get to the weather forecasts. And just on the photo, that's actually from a farm last week that started harvesting in the Mallee region, which is in the southern part of the mainland in Victoria. On the weather forecast, I've got 2 forecasts there. One's the next 9 days, or the weekly forecast, or the next fortnight. That's important because now we're really seeing harvest pick up in South Australia and Victoria and in southern New South Wales. So that's the important element in the sense that it's mostly dry, which is good news for the harvest, and it won't have a disruption. They have had disruption in the last couple of weeks. 3-month outlook I've put there more as a positive. So we're looking at some actually good rains through Queensland and New South Wales. That's good for soil and moisture and setting up the season for next year. Obviously a lot can happen between then and now, but that's a pretty good forecast. Obviously Western Australia, however, is looking pretty dry. So yeah, the 25-26 forecast. So this is based on figures from the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Resource Economics. In a second, we'll run through 2 slides, and then I'll run through a slide which includes Bendigo Bank, which is a financial institution in Australia, as well as the prediction of the US gains report, which was only put out 1 or 2 weeks ago. So the official government, Australia, my department's forecast at the moment is 33.8 million tonnes. You can see it also has the numbers there for barley and canola. And there's good moisture and opportunities in the summer crop, but as I said, the summer crop is going to be much, much smaller. 4th largest on record, you can see, so there's not much more that I haven't added already on that one. Here's a breakup. So it gives you a bit of the current forecast for wheat production in 25-26, broken down by Australian states. I've also included in there a yield, which gives you a pretty clear indication of the average being between 2 and 3 tonnes a hectare, and Tasmania really being the one that stands out at something closer to 6 tonnes a hectare. So that's a little unusual, but fair to say a lot of those yields are a bit higher than what was predicted at mid-year, and indeed the prediction is even, is a bit more positive than that in terms of the outlook. So these are those projections I mentioned. So at the top, we've got the winter crop production. Obviously, this is the estimate there of the Bendigo Bank. They're saying a harvest of wheat of around 35.25 million tonnes. That's obviously 1.5 million more than what's predicted by what's being predicted by the government forecaster. It also gives you an indication of where we are on the harvest to date, which shows that effectively Queensland is pretty much finished all its harvest of grains. New South Wales is pretty much halfway through, but there's a lot of work to do in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. So we won't know the final numbers until Western Australia really gets going. One of the grain traders did say, funny thing about numbers that keep getting bigger is that they keep getting bigger. So everyone's a bit cautious, seems to be of the view that Western Australia might exceed expectations, not just on wheat, but in barley and a few other crops. So the other element I've got in that in there is this is an estimation of the grades of wheat, which breaks it up according to Australian hard, Australian premium, hard as well. So not just, so that's very preliminary. I think the grain, probably from the grain traders or estimates from what's being delivered to Bungi and GrainCorp and a number of others. So, and then we've got the US Gains report. Their estimate is actually higher than 35.2. They've got us potentially producing something closer to 62 million tonnes overall in grain and closer to 36 million tonnes of wheat. So that was from a couple of weeks ago. These numbers here from Bendigo Bank were put out yesterday. Next week, effectively the 2nd of December, they wouldn't let me break the news now, is the forecast, is the next update or quarterly update from the Australian government. So we'll see if that's increased. I think I'm going to probably run out a bit of a time, so I'll scoot through some of the next ones. We've got a few, we've gone to the question, I guess, of price and quality. So I put up a few charts over the next number of slides which are sort of highlighting are off ABARES data. This one is very imperfect because it's not measuring like for like. It's basically measuring an average of all Australian wheat against US hard red, which I don't think is a very useful measure. But what it does show that in the years of 22, 23, and this will be consistent in the next series of diagrams, is Australian wheat, because of the conditions that were out there, because of low harvests in the US, Canada, and a number of other countries, in that environment for a number of years, we were significantly under many other suppliers. And that's potentially of interest, obviously, because we're a quality producer and provider, and it may be that we're not just competing on price, we're also competing on quality, and that's something I think millers in South America will be interested in. So this is a really messy set of squiggly lines, but this is again showing something similar. This is actually the last 12 months. What it does actually show is that during the last 12 months, there's been periods where Australian wheat has been competitive on a FOB basis against US, Canada, and even potentially Argentinian wheat. However, in the majority of periods, the reality is it has been, like for like, has been more expensive. So, and that's a lot to do with the freight costs. So that's but if I had a graph to show what was happening in 22, 23, and 23, 24, it would show something quite different to that. This is another example of that. This was done by a colleague in Grain Trades Australia. They were looking at the spreads, but those circles that I've put there indicate when Australian trade against the examples there. They've got examples against Argentinian wheat, Canadian and US wheat. And during some of those periods in particular, you can see that, I think it's the Canadian one that stands out, that Australian wheat was highly competitive during large periods over the last 5 years. Right, so I think that's sort of bringing me towards close to the end. I guess trading with Australia, we're a reliable supplier of quality grain. Australia's export program continues to increase. You've seen the numbers. We continue to see export growth. Seems to be that we break a new number every year. It looks like Western Australia used to be a miracle that it would actually reach 20 million tonnes annually. It's now done that almost every year. So the view is that that's actually going to continue and only go northward. I've put in the sovereign risk and international instability. One thing is Australia's a consistent trading partner. I used to say when I was the advisor to the minister 4 or 5 years ago and we were having issues with one of our trading partners, ultimately, if they want to come back and buy it, we will sell it. And that's the reality with Australia. We will, if you want to buy Australian wheat, it's one of the easiest things to do. If you want to trade with Australia, it's very simple. And that's been one of the advantages in terms of trading barley. Traders have been surprised how easy it's actually been to pick up Australian product. So we can be your Pacific partner. Here's the sales pitch. We're already here. We're already trading barley and canola. We're already exploring options in other markets around the world. We're also exploring options, obviously, here in South America. So we think there's an opportunity. Logistics isn't a challenge. We know this now from canola. We know this now from barley, that if you've got a high-quality product and there are advantages in the processing of it, then it'll find a market. Yes, we can be obviously logistics and freight is a high cost, but at least in those two commodities, we've managed to overcome that problem. Diversification works both ways. We're always, as a government, encouraging our Australian producers to be able to have a diverse range of markets. To tell you the truth, when we were exporting 7.5 million tonnes to China, it wasn't something, as a government, we were necessarily comfortable at the time, but it was simply the reality of the market. And climate variability, I mean, it's a bit of a perfect storm this year. We have a combination of La Nina and El Nino that we're both getting the best of both worlds. We seem to all have a huge peak production period, but it wasn't so long ago where we were in deep drought and the Northern Hemisphere had huge rains. It wasn't so long ago that Argentina and Brazil experienced some pretty large storms and drought before that. So, and it's always useful and good to know that you have an option, other options to purchase. As I mentioned, Grain Trades Australia, this is I've got the website up there. That's what you'll find. That's the list of all of the traders. That's their names. So you can, if you at least want to start a discussion, if it's not on wheat, if it's another product that you're looking at milling, that's always, we're always happy, and they're always happy to talk. And as I said, they're already trading with companies here and traders in South America. I've got 3 minutes left, so I might save everyone. So, por último, me gustaría volver a dar las gracias a Andy y Fedemol por organizar el Congreso y brindarme esta oportunidad de hablar sobre la industria del trigo australiano, el trigo. Gracias.